Hey Smallville fans, Bizarro Pat here. Here's my review for this week's past episode, Abandoned. So the general plot of Abandoned is that the Luthor mansion's broken into by a strange visitor who leaves behind this small music box that Tess once owned and she had been having nightmares of. So she tries to investigate that while Lois discovers that her father left behind a box of her mother's old stuff, including videos that are messages to Lois from her mother's time in the hospital. So she watches those and realizes that Clark shouldn't have to go through life without his father, Jor-El, but as Clark tells her, Jor-El's not really his dad, Jonathan is. But she still tries to rekindle things between Clark and Jor-El by looking through the loft and finding maps of the Kawachi caves and the key, and traveling to the fortress, pretty much giving a verbal bitch-smacking to that asshole Jor-El. Clark, in the meantime, is helping Tess uncover who broke into her mansion, and it leads them to this orphanage run by Granny Goodness, who, as comic fans and fans of the Superman animated TV show back from the 90s know, Granny Goodness is a minion of Darkseid, and she showed up real briefly in the Season 9 finale, right after Tess died. So, Clark realizes the orphanage is all front for Granny Goodness training and breeding these orphan girls into female Furies who will serve in the coming war that Granny mentions. Clark is captured by the Furies, whose weapons are powered by, of course, kryptonite. Granny reveals that Tess's real family, her biological parents, gave her up to the orphanage for a little while, and Granny had started Tess's transformation into a Fury, but Tess had managed to get out of there before she was able to, years ago. So while Granny's trying to reinitiate Tess back into the household, Clark manages to save the day, using pretty much all of his powers in one scene, which is pretty awesome. Clark goes to the fortress afterward, where he gets a message from Jor-El that's a recording of Lara and Jor-El shortly before Krypton exploded. And we also learn that Darkseid's minions are gathering and preparing for his arrival. Granny Goodness, Desaad, who own the Fetish Club, seen in Supergirl, episode 3 of this season, and Gordon Godfrey, who was also seen in Supergirl this season. And the episode ends with Tess realizing who she is while looking at her birth certificate, and she discovers that she's none other than Lionel Luthor's illegitimate daughter, Lutessa Lena Luthor, and her mother is Pamela Barnes, who fans may remember as a character who visited Lex in Season 1. I believe it was the episode Crush. Now, on to the review. Overall, I'd have to say I really liked Abandoned. I thought it was a very jam-packed episode with some nice reveals and a little bit more hints at Darkseid showing up. I really liked the whole theme that ran throughout the course of the episode of people who have to deal with being abandoned, quote-unquote, or left behind by their parents. We had Lois and her mother, Clark and Jor-El, and Tess and Lionel. And I thought this was just a really interesting theme. I liked it throughout the episode, and I thought Granny Goodness was a really good foil for that, since she brings in all these children that she thinks are now part of her family because she's taking care of them. And torturing them, by the way. But yeah, I thought this was a very good episode. Things I really liked. One of my favorite scenes in the entire episode, just as a big comic book fan, was one of the final scenes, which was when Granny Goodness meets with Desaad and Gordon Godfrey. And we find out, which I was a bit confused about in my Supergirl review, just what happened to Godfrey in Supergirl earlier this season. When he was possessed by Darkseid, Desaad put it as he was anointed and chosen when he was possessed to be a minion of Darkseid. So now he is permanently evil and serving Darkseid, even though Darkseid left him when he attacked Clark in Supergirl. So I guess that makes sense, and I really like that these are the minions of Darkseid getting together preparing for the coming war. Although I'm not sure if Granny or Desaad was possessed by Darkseid at one point. They very well could have been, and that's very interesting. I think that he's literally this guy who corrupts people, just like they were saying would happen to Clark if Darkseid took over him. And they finally gave Darkseid his name in this episode. The whole season they'd just been referring to him as the Darkness, but we finally got his name this episode, even though we all knew who he was, but Desaad spoke his name, which was the first time we'd heard it the whole season. Now I know a lot of people have been kind of, I don't know, not liking the fact that Darkseid hasn't really been present a lot this season so far, but like I've said, this is still the first half of the season. And I know people are like, but Zod and Davis, they were there from the get-go in their particular seasons. That's true, they were. The difference is, however, Darkseid, he can't be there like Davis and Zod could. Davis and Zod, individually, Davis could have tons of scenes with Chloe, or even Clark, where they could just be talking, and Zod could do that too. He had tons of scenes with Tess, and he had scenes with Clark where he'd just be talking to him about Krypton's past or whatever. Darkseid's not like that. He's literally evil incarnate. He makes Zod and Davis look like little puppies, evil-wise. I know Zod is a ruthless killer, and Davis was a monster, but Darkseid, he would only be able to have scenes where he's speaking with his henchmen, because if he spoke to if he had a scene with Oliver, he'd rather just kill Oliver or take control of him, I'm guessing, rather than mince words like Zod and Tess did all the time. So I'm pretty okay with what we've gotten of Darkseid so far, and the fact that they're speaking about a coming war and how Darkseid's going to be coming, I really think he's going to have a big role in the second half of the season, and so far, the end of Lazarus, the whole of Supergirl with Godfrey, and now seeing Granny and all that stuff that happened in this episode has really been pretty good setup for what we're going to be seeing, no doubt, in the second half of the season. Darkseid is really just, they're building him up to be the guy who's there when Clark is about to take his final step. So he's the final obstacle Clark has to pass. Just evil in general. He's complete evil, and Clark has to defeat that evil and become Superman. So I'm pretty happy with that. Speaking of which, I also really liked Granny Goodness in this episode. I had honestly expected her to be showing up a bit earlier this season, since we got to see a brief cameo of her at the end of Salvation at the end of Season 9, which she talked about how she was the one who took Tess from the hospital and brought her to Cadmus Labs, so we finally learned just what she had done when she went into Tess's room. Who exactly is running Cadmus Labs, we're still not fully sure of. We just know that there were Lex clones there, and that they healed Tess there. But I really liked Granny. I was a little bit worried that they were going to be toning her down a bit, making her less creepy and evil old lady, and just a bit more sweetsy kind of old lady with an edge. But no, she was a lot like Granny from the comics. She was willing to just wipe people's minds while still telling them, "Oh, I'm here for you, dear. I'm Granny Goodness. You're my children." Yeah, she still had that whole vibe going, which I was fine with. And though I'd love to have seen Ed Asner or Betty White even to play her, I thought the woman playing her did a pretty good job at capturing the Granny Goodness from the comics. I loved having Helen Slater and Julian Sands back as Gerald and Laura, even for just that brief, 2 minutes. That whole just video message was fantastic. Clark finally got to see his two parents together and hear them talking about him going on and being a better person, but he'd have to be doing that without them. And oh my goodness, Terry Hatcher as Ella Lane, Lois's mom, that whole scene with her video was pretty emotional. I thought it was just a really cool passing of the torch, just seeing one Lois Lane, and as most of you no doubt know, Terry Hatcher played Lois in Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman in the 90s. Just seeing one Lois Lane of kind of giving advice and encouragement to the Lois Lane of this decade was pretty awesome. I really enjoyed that a lot. Now, Justin Hartley's wife, who played Harriet in this episode, Granny Goodness's lead female Fury, she'd been getting a lot of publicity. They've been kind of having all these interviews about her character. So I was expecting her to be in it a bit more than she was. I thought she was decent for what she was in. But I think I would have liked to have seen a bit more of her character. I hope I get to see more of it later this season, because I know Mad Harriet from the comics, so it was cool seeing her on screen, despite, 5 minutes of screen time. I thought just seeing a lot of the female Furies was cool, and I'm not sure if the one with the cable/whip thing, if that's supposed to be Smallville's Lashina, but I just thought their whole vibe was pretty cool. They were just these really tough women who were willing to just slice men open, as they were doing to Clark. Yeah, I really thought they were pretty cool. Now, before I get on to the big reveal of this episode, which I'll discuss, I'll talk about my few negative points of this episode. The use of kryptonite seemed unnecessary. It was just a ploy to have Clark be able to be captured by the Furies, but I would have preferred to see the Furies be able to beat him up just on their own without any kryptonite. I think that would have made them an even more viable threat to him, instead of having him just come undone by kryptonite again. And there was also the small plot hole of Clark. We didn't see him picking up the girl he had rescued, and he had told her to wait in a room while he dealt with the Furies and Granny. We never saw him come back and tell her that it was okay. And we don't even know what happened to that orphanage. I feel like Clark would have at least tried to rescue all those girls, maybe not the older ones who had already been become brainwashed, but the younger ones, I would have thought he would have at least, even if he just exposed them in an article for the Daily Planet, him trying to save those girls from Granny. I would have liked to have seen him try and do that. But other than those things, I thought it was a pretty strong episode. Now, the big reveal at the end, like I said, was Tess discovers that she's Lionel Luthor's illegitimate daughter, Lutessa Lena Luthor. Now, this is not the first time we've heard of Lionel having illegitimate children. If you remember Lucas Luthor, who appeared in one episode of Season 2, and who I was hoping someday would come back, but seems unlikely now that the actor's got obligations to the Vampire Diaries show. So we find out that she's the daughter of Lionel Luthor and Pamela Barnes, who was a nurse for Lex's mother, and she worked for Lionel, and she had also become kind of a mother figure to Lex while his mother was sick. Now, I really thought this was a cool... I mean, some people might have expected it. I mean, there was the red hair and the fact that why would Lex give over his company to this random woman? It makes so much more sense now. And the fact that Alexander's skin was used to heal Tess in the beginning of the season, a skin graft, that makes much more sense now, too. I'm not sure how long the writers have been planning this, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it kind of added a cool dynamic to the Luthor family, reestablishing that Lionel had been not fully faithful to Lex's mother. So I really like that. I mean, Lutessa Lena Luthor, and Lena is, for those of you who may not know, Lex's sister's name in the comics. So I enjoyed the whole big reveal, and I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes, especially if Lex comes back. Or maybe how she treats Alexander different, maybe realizing, this guy's my half-brother. Can I really do this to him, despite the fact that he's turning into a monster? There's a ton of roads we can go from this point, so I'm really looking forward to all of that. And bringing in someone like Pamela Barnes, remembering that small element from one episode in Season 1, and bringing that to make it plausible that Tessa's Lionel's daughter, I really think the writers have been doing well with continuity, but that's a whole discussion for a whole nother time, and I'm running out of time here. But I'm gonna have to give Abandoned an 8.5 out of 10. I really liked it. It was a strong episode. It was just a very good all-around episode. So, see you next time, guys.